All right, we are live, and so thank you guys so much for joining. I got my good friend Dr. Jonathan McLatchie with me, and we are here to talk about your doubts. And so, particularly New Testament doubts, doubts about historicity of the Gospels, Acts, reliability issues, and different things like that. And so, I will post a link here to invite people who want to come up. You don't have to come up on camera if you feel a little bit shy, but I just do need to verify that you're an actual real person and not just somebody trolling or anything like that. So I will be sure to link that here in just a second. I need to go pin it. I probably should have done that before we got started. But anyways, for those of you who don't know, Talk About Doubts is a service, Jonathan, that you started a few years back. Why don't you give us a brief rundown of kind of the history of what Talk About Doubts is and what it's all about and all that good stuff?
Yeah, talkaboutdoubts.com launched in December of 2021 in its present form, although I'd been doing it previously on my own personal website going as far back as 2016. But essentially, we are an organization that specializes in offering free private mentoring to Christians who struggle with doubts about faith, as well as former Christians who want to explore whether there's a rational path back to faith. And so the way it works is someone comes to our website, talkaboutdoubts.com, and they fill out a contact form. And we distribute that to one of our volunteer specialists who will get in contact with the inquirer to schedule a private Zoom call. And these are typically one-on-one or two-on-one sessions and typically lead to long-term mentoring relationships. We also have a Discord community that we invite past inquirers to. And we have an emotional support group that runs every other week that's run by one of our past inquirers every other Thursday. And then we have another emotional support group that runs every other Saturday, run by a different past inquirer. We also have a book club that runs every other week. And we have around 80 or so volunteers on our network. And so we have experts with diverse areas of expertise, ranging from New Testament studies, Old Testament studies, textual criticism, biblical archaeology, philosophy, philosophical theology, the natural sciences, psychology. We have pastors, and so forth. And so our goal is to take people who are struggling with doubts and pair them with someone bona fide expert in that particular subject. And calls typically last on average an hour to an hour and a half. So it's a good amount of time to really unpack your doubts. And often we have multiple calls over an extended period of time with people. So if you are struggling with doubts, or if you're a former Christian, or even if you're not a Christian, but you're interested in exploring the evidence for Christianity, feel free to reach out at talkaboutdoubts.com, and we'd love to be in touch.
Yeah, definitely. And so it's something that I've been a counselor on for, I don't know, a few years now. And it's always awesome to see the lights come on when you're sharing some of the evidence, the positive evidence for Christianity. A lot of times these are arguments that people just never even heard of. They might be just kind of familiar with some, surface level kind of introduction to Christian apologetics reading, like, I don't know, The Case for Christ or something like that. And so when you go through just how detailed and thorough and strong some of this evidence is, you can really see kind of their eyes light up, and you see kind of the relief on their face, and just some of the joy of their salvation come back as they realize, hey, what I'm believing isn't just some sort of fairy tale or myth, or these criticisms that I'm hearing on the internet really just, as it turns out, aren't really as strong as I thought.
Right.
And so it's definitely a huge blessing to be a part of that. Who are some of the counselors? I mean, besides I name myself, but who are some of the people that are helping you with this?
We have people like Tim McGrew, who's one of our earliest volunteers that was helping out with these calls even before had the launch of Talk About Doubts in its current form. Bethel McGrew, his daughter. So Tim's a philosopher and an expert also on New Testament studies. Bethel has a PhD in mathematics and is an independent journalist. There's people like yourself. There's our friend Cody Nelson, who finished his bachelor's degree recently at Reinhardt University in religious studies. There's Dr. Titus Kennedy, who's a biblical archaeologist. Luke Barnes, who's an astrophysicist with a in cosmology and the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. We have Wes Huff has volunteered in the past. He's a little unavailable right now because he's finishing up his PhD dissertation and so forth. We have people in various academic fields, including biology, like Doug Axe, for example, your viewers have probably heard of, or Scott Minnick volunteers sometimes. So yeah, we have a lot of different experts in various fields. Douglas Grithius is another example.
Yeah, is he still at Denver Seminary? Is that right?
He is living in Grand Rapids now in Michigan.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I knew he was at Denver Seminary.
He's a professor, but I forget the name of which institution he's at currently.
Okay, right on. So I do see some comments or that we could answer kind of in the meantime, but this is a live. You can come up, you can talk to us. What we're wanting to do with these lives is give you a sampling of kind of what we do on the calls. Now, it's not going to be perfect because we're not going to do a whole hour-long conversation with just one person, but we can answer some questions quickly. And again, Jonathan and I, when we do calls together, it's typically focused on the reliability of the New Testament, the Gospels, Acts, and different things like that. And so yeah, that's normally what we kind of talk about. I do see one guy in the lobby, Jay. If you could just, all you need to do for a quick second is, if you can, turn on your camera and just wave. You don't have to be on camera if you don't want to, but I just want you to verify. Are you a Christian? If you are, give me a thumbs up. Or okay, all right. And so, is your question about reliability of Gospels, or what's your? Can you type it in the private chat super quick for me, Jay? Not to put you off too long here. And then Fairs, if you could do the same. I see a few already popping up, so I'll let him chat real quick. Ex-Mormonism. Okay. Have some questions. All right, that's fine. We could answer some questions real quick. All right. So Jay, thank you so much for coming on up. Welcome to the live, brother. How can we help you?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
you. So I'm an ex-Mormon. I got baptized in the LDS church beginning of the year, literally December 31st. Got out of the church in about March, I want to say, after I discovered different things. Because they told me Book of Mormon, Bible goes hand in hand. They go together. And then I started noticing differences of my own, where the Lord's Prayer in the Book of Mormon doesn't contain "Give us today our daily bread," which was like the first difference that I started noticing.
Okay.
Would I be able to get some insight on like differences that go further from the two, or at least how to engage in like apologetics against that?
Engaging with Mormons. Sure. I mean, there's a couple good books that I would recommend. Robert Bowman has got a book on, I think it's called Jesus Resurrection, and let me look it up real quick. Just doing a quick Google. Jesus Resurrection and Joseph's Visions, where he talks about the kind of evidential differences between the foundations of the two religions. And so what he's going to be talking about is there's critics who will say, why not believe in Joseph's visions, because like Paul had a similar experience to the road on the road to Damascus and all of that kind of stuff. And so like, what's the difference between the resurrection appearances to the apostles or to the apostle Paul, and compared to like what Joseph Smith saw, or the three others who said that they saw the angel Moroni, or the 11 who saw the plates. And what Bowman does is he just compares the evidence for the resurrection against these claims. And so I would definitely recommend that. Anything pretty much by Eric Johnson, Mormonism is pretty good. Like I think there's like a Mormonism 101 is fine. It's called Mormonism 101, Examining the Religion of the Latter-day Saints. It's by Bill McKeever and Eric Johnson. So that's a couple of good resources there. They look at more of like the theology and comparing it to Christianity and some of the theological problems, but they look at some of the historical things too. And so if you're looking to kind of like make sure that what you left is definitely wrong and that there's evidence for Christianity, then I think both of those would kind of be a decent start for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Because even after I left the church, like interacting with Mormons, I mean, they basically do a similar thing with like the Islamic shuffle. I mean, I've watched different apologetics, Sam Shimon, God Logic, but they don't touch. At least God Logic doesn't touch on Mormonism. Mostly sticks to Islam. And
Mostly, me and Logic
when
actually did a show where we talked to like 3 Mormons. If you look back in the archives, you'll see that we actually
but
talked
it's just
about.
like trying to find those with like basic YouTube searches.
Yeah, there's
It's
not
like,
as far as YouTube, and really your best resources are always going to be books anyways. So I don't really have like, I mean, I know there's what's the name of it? God Loves Mormons is a pretty decent resource, but any YouTube channel, including my own, is only going to be an introduction to any subject. Your best bet is to always go with books. And so, because you're going to be able to get a little bit more in depth with a book and different things like that. And so, but God Loves Mormons is got a lot of really good stuff against a lot of the historical claims, the theological claims. They really do have a lot of good videos. I don't know how they fly under the radar as much as they do, other than maybe just Mormon polemics isn't as big of a topic or something. Does that
mind
help a
if
little
I
bit?
give like an example about like my most recent interaction? I mean, I did a debate against a Mormon where I used Galatians 1:8 to mostly have like a foundational point against what goes against the gospel, and then I presented Second Nephi 25:23, which goes over faith after everything that you can do, which is like one of the things that I read in their book while I was there. And then before I could even get to the biblical contradiction of that, he basically took me on a rabbit trail of Samuel having multiple wives. I took him to Samuel and David having multiple wives. I took him to Deuteronomy 17:17. And then he hit me with a response that literally gave me a what reaction, going to verse 16, talking about it's the same language, talking about not having multiple horses. And in my head, I'm just like, what? Like multiple horses, multiple wives aren't even the same thing.
It looks like to me mostly you're looking for kind of like polemics to help your former Mormon friends, and that's good. The purpose of this particular show is to talk to Christians with doubts. And so what I would say, Jay, no, you're fine. You're fine. What I would say to just kind of answer your question in a nutshell, if it's me, there's a couple of things that I do when if I'm going to go after Mormonism, I'm just going to compare the historical foundations of Christianity versus the historical foundations. I'm not going to even as much engage in all the doctrinal issues, although they are multivarious with Mormonism, belief that you could become a god and, like this endless chain of infinite gods and all these other weird things that go on with the theology. But really, when you look at the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is what I mentioned in the book with Bowman before, versus like the undetailed appearances of the angel Moroni and the translation, the weird issues with the golden plates and like what did they really see, and people saying they just saw it through a spiritual eye and different things like that. The foundations are just like can't be any more different. And so that's kind of where I go if I'm going to attack Mormonism. Is just like I have a rational justification for Christianity. You guys don't. You have basically some people's trust me bros and undetailed reports of golden plates, which by themselves aren't even miraculous, and some dead prophet / angel who reappeared to 3 dudes in the woods in New York. And so I just don't find that compelling compared to the disciples and the experiences that they had as described in the Gospels. And so there's just no rational reason for me to be Mormon. And so I would just attack the fact that they don't have an irrational foundation of their faith. And so, but check out the books that I recommended. That might kind of help you. But again, I got to move on because this is dedicated to Christians who have questions and doubts. So,
no, I get you. God bless my brother.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming up. All right. Fair says he has a doubt about faith and salvation. Question about Mark 10:18. Muslims stops calling Jesus good. Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, we could talk about that. All right, Fairs. Could you just if you have a camera, can you? Well, you put a lot in the or Maestro actually was the one who I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
There. Okay. All right, Maestro. Maestro, are you there?
He disappeared.
All right, I guess he changed his mind. Bears, can you tell me just real quick? Doubt your faith and salvation a lot. What do you think, Jonathan? Is it related to this historical issues? I mean, we could kind of be some help, but we're trying to kind of keep the streamlined more about like gospel reliability issues and different things like that. Historical doubt too. Okay.
And Lars, also, if you could state what questions you want to ask about, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah. Anyone in the studio chat, specifically put in your doubt. And we can be helpful. So, since Lars said something, he has a question about Herod. I'm going to add him first while Bears is working on unpacking what's going on a little bit more. So, all right, Lars.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
I can hear you. You're
All right.
You're looking snuggly there.
Yeah, it's the stuffed animal I put in my sister's casket.
Oh, gee. Okay. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe that was
No, don't worry. I put it there because I loved it so much. But anyways, God bless you guys, and sorry for the accent. I'm from Sweden.
That's okay.
But I have a question about Luke chapter 2. It talks about Jesus' birth and all of that.
Yeah.
And like I've read about it before, and I know that there is an answer to this, but I just don't quite remember it because I read about this like a year ago.
Okay.
So how would you guys tackle the problem if somebody says that, oh no, Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem because Luke got it wrong? Because like if Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem, then he's not the Messiah.
Where does Luke say that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem?
No, the Bible does say that he's born in Bethlehem,
exactly.
but skeptics argue that like they added that to make it basically to fake a biblical prophecy.
Are you talking about the census, or is because that's kind of a critical target for a lot of people? Is that Luke made up the census to get Jesus to Bethlehem? Okay. So think about this for a second, and then I'll let Jonathan dive in a little bit. But just from a common sense standpoint, if you're going to invent some sort of like plot device in order to get Jesus from Nazareth to Bethlehem in order that he could be born, a census would be the clumsiest, goofiest way that you could possibly do that, because people lived in a time when they probably would have participated in a census. They could have easily kind of called them out on something like that if it didn't happen. And inventing a whole census just to fulfill a prophecy that, by the way, Luke never even mentions the Micah 5:2 prophecy that's only found in the Gospel of Matthew. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's kind of like using a steamroller to crack a peanut.
But at the same time, like, this was the ancient world. So, like if like, let's say you, like, I can't even be sure that you were born in the US. Like I'm guessing that you were born there, but I don't really know you. And if I knew somebody at the age of like 30 in the ancient world, there would be basically no way for me to prove that, yeah, you were born in Bethlehem, especially since he grew up in Nazareth.
But Luke was personally connected to individuals who knew Jesus.
Can you say that again?
Luke was personally connected to individuals who knew Jesus during his lifetime, including members of Jesus' family, because Luke is present with Paul in Acts 21 when Paul meets with the Jerusalem elders, and Luke mentions James in particular. That's James, the brother of Jesus, and he says all the elders are present. So Luke is in a position to know, to have reliable information about these sorts of things.
But as I understood it, like it was like at face value, it's kind of problematic because was like Luke talks about Herod wanting is YouTube as sensitive at TikTok? And do you have to say unalive, or can you say?
Oh, you're fine. Don't worry about saying killed. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how sensitive YouTube is. Anyways, yeah, like the biblical story is that Herod told like his military to go and kill all babies and whatever, but he died like before that or something like that. I don't. Again, like I've read about this before, but it was like a year ago, so I don't remember all the details.
It sounds like you're talking about the Quirinius issue. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's that.
Well, I think he's talking about the Quirinius issue, but just there, I think he's talking about the issue in Matthew where it's kind of more of the argument from silence about murder, the putting to death, the slaughter of the innocents, and how some critics will say, "Oh, we have no record of that happening, so therefore it didn't happen." So I think there's some things being a little conflated here.
Okay, let's address both of those. I'll share my screen here so that I can share some Logos magic. 1 second here.
Oh, right. Let me
pull this up here. Okay,
make sure. There we go.
Okay, let's address the Quirinius issue first, and then I'll come on to the question of. Then I'll come on to the question of the slaughter of the innocents in Matthew. So, in Luke chapter 2, it says, "In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus, all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria." Now, the word that's used for governor here in the Greek is hegemonevo, which is a broader term than simply denoting the office of a legate. Quirinius, of course, famously became legate of Syria in 6 AD. But this is a broader term that simply refers to ruling, commanding, or leading. In fact, in the next chapter, in Luke chapter 3, Pontius Pilate is given that same term, hegemonevo. And he obviously wasn't a legate, right? He was prefect of Judea, right? So this is a general term for commanding, ruling, or leading. And it turns out, if you read Tacitus, that Quirinius, prior to this, had held a military position, as a military officer. So this is from Tacitus, Annals of Imperial Rome, Volume 3. It says, about the same time, he requested the Senate to let the death of Sulpicius Quirinius be celebrated with a public funeral. With the old patrician family of the Sulpici, this Quirinius, who was born in the town of Lanuvium, was quite unconnected. An indefatigable soldier, he had by his zealous services won the consulship under the divine Augustus, and subsequently the honors of a triumph for having stormed some fortresses of the Homonadenses in Cilicia. He was also appointed advisor to Caius Caesar in the government of Armenia, and had likewise paid court to Tiberius, who was then at Rhodes. The emperor now made all this known to the Senate, and extolled the good offices of Quirinius to himself, while he censured Marcus Lollius, whom he charged with encouraging Caius Caesar in his perverse and quarrelsome behavior. But people generally had no pleasure in the memory of Quirinius because of the perils he had brought, as I have related, on Lepida, and the meanness and dangerous power of his last years. So this indicates that Quirinius, prior to becoming legate of Syria, held a position as a military officer. And so, and it was customary for
like a general.
Yeah, and it was customary for a Roman census to be administered by a military officer. And so, I think that quite plausibly, Quirinius was in the area previously, holding that post as a military officer, and he administered the census. So that's a very plausible explanation for why Quirinius is connected with or associated with the census in Luke, even though, and by the way, bear in mind, Luke also tells us that Jesus' birth happened during the reign of Herod the Great, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at in Luke chapter 1, oops. Um,
And just while you're looking that up, Jonathan, I'm just going to say, just to clarify for the audience there who might be like out of the loop and wondering what we're talking about, what you'll often see is like biblical critics like Bart Ehrman or like Dan McClellan or people like that say that there's a 10-year gap between Matthew and Luke's nativity accounts, and that Matthew places Jesus' birth during the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC. So his birth must be before then, but Luke mentions a census under Quirinius, who became governor of Syria in 6 AD. And that's the only recorded Roman census in the region, and it happened a decade later. And so the claim is Matthew is before 4 BC or around that. Luke is 680, so they both can't be true. That's a 10-year gap. So therefore, Luke made a big mistake. That's actually part of the objection.
Luke tells us that Jesus' birth happened in the days of Herod, king of Judea, which would be Herod the Great. So whatever explanation we provide of Luke's language, it has to be consistent with that fact. Luke's aware both of Jesus being born in the reign of Herod the Great, and then also connects the census to Quirinius. So I think the explanation that I provided is quite a plausible one, that Quirinius was in the area previously serving in the capacity of a military officer, and that he was involved in administrating the census, which is why it's associated with him in Luke chapter 2, verse 2. As far as the Quirinius issue is concerned, does that make sense?
Yeah.
As far as the situation with the massacre of the innocents, so this is in Matthew chapter 2. And we read that Herod, when he saw that he'd been tricked by the wise men, or the Magi, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. And this is quite consistent with Herod the Great's character as portrayed by Josephus, right? There's Herod the Great was a narcissist. He wrongly suspected 2 of his sons of plotting against him, and so he had them strangled. His young brother-in-law was becoming too popular for Herod's liking, and so he arranged for him to be involved in a drowning accident. On his deathbed, he had a more Absalom-like son called Antipater put to death. In fact, he was such a narcissist that he was concerned, because he was so unpopular, that no one was going to mourn his death. And so when he's on his deathbed, he actually wanted his men to round up influential Jews, and on the day of his death kill them, so at least then there would be mourning on the day of his death. I mean, he was quite a narcissist. And so this is quite consistent with Herod the Great's character profile as represented by Josephus. The fact that this particular episode is not mentioned in Josephus is a very weak argument against it, because this is an argument from silence, which are notoriously problematic in historiography. Another point here is that Herod the Great passes away in 4 BC. Could you mute when because I'm getting a lot of background noise here.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Yeah. In Matthew chapter 2, it says, verse 19, when Herod died, so this is around 4 BC, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And so it would have been a reasonable inference for Joseph to draw that in the wake of the death of Herod the Great, his eldest son, Archelaus, would be reigning in his father's stead. And so in that knowledge, he's on his way back to Judea. It says he arose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But something happens in verse 22 that changes his travel itinerary. When he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea, in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Right. So, what's the historical background here? Why is Joseph so afraid of Archelaus right around this particular time? Well, let's look up Josephus. Josephus tells us that one of the last things that Herod the Great did before his death was to have certain Jews burned to death for having removed the Roman eagle from the Jewish temple because it violated the second commandment about having graven images and so forth. Herod the Great found out who was responsible and had them killed. And Herod the Great passed away not long thereafter, and shortly thereafter rolled around the Jewish Feast of Unleavened Bread, also known as the Passover Feast. And we pick up the story here in Josephus. He says, now upon the approach of that Feast of Unleavened Bread, which the law of their fathers had appointed for the Jews at this time, which feast is called the Passover, and is a memorial of their deliverance out of Egypt, when they offer sacrifice with great alacrity, and when they are required to slay more sacrifices in number than any other festival, and when an innumerable multitude came thither out of the country, nay, from beyond its limits also, in order to worship God. The seditious lamented Judas and Matthias, those teachers of the laws, and kept together in the temple, and had plenty of food, because these seditious persons were not ashamed to get it. And as Archelaus was afraid lest some terrible thing should spring up by means of these men's madness, he sent a regiment of armed men, and with them a captain of 1,000, to suppress the violent efforts of the seditious, before the whole multitude should be infected with the like madness, and gave them this charge, that if they found any more much more openly seditious than others, and more busy in tumultuous practices, they should bring them to him. But those that were seditious on account of those teachers of the law irritated the people by the noise and clamors they used to encourage the people in their designs. So they made an assault upon the soldiers and came up to them and stoned the greatest part of them, although some of them ran away wounded, and their captain among them. And when they had thus done, they returned to the sacrifices which were already in their hands. So this mob of Jews picked up stones, and they actually stoned these Roman soldiers to death, which is a very serious crime. Now, Archelaus thought there was no way to preserve the entire government but by cutting off those who made this attempt upon it. So he sent out his whole army upon them, and sent the horsemen to prevent those that had their tents without the temple from assisting those that were within the temple, and to kill such as ran away from the footmen when they thought themselves out of danger. Right, so picture the scene. He surrounds the temple with the horsemen with instructions, don't let anyone leave or enter the temple. He sends the infantry into the temple with instructions, kill everyone you find. It says, which horsemen slew 3,000 men, while the rest went to the neighboring mountains. It was a massacre. And then notice what Josephus goes on to say next. It says, then did Archelaus order a proclamation to be made to them all, that they should retire to their own homes. So they went away and left the festival out of fear of somewhat worse which would follow, although they had been so bold by reason of their want of instruction. And so Archelaus, after that massacre of 3,000 Jews in the temple, remember it's Passover when the temple is particularly crowded, he announces to those out with in the surrounding region of Judea, Passover this year is cancelled, return to your homes. And so you can imagine Joseph and his family on his way back from Egypt, coming back into Judea. And who did they meet on the road? This mass of fleeing pilgrims coming out of Judea. He hears what just happened, and he thinks perhaps it's best not to go into Judea right now, and so he goes to Galilee instead. So this is an example where Josephus actually supplies historical background or backstory that helps to explain and illuminate what's going on in the biblical narrative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say so. But most importantly, I would say that the most convincing is that it's an argument from silence the critics have. So, but to be honest, like I didn't understand everything you said, but my plan was to like run back the recording and listen carefully anyways.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. A lot of this is new to people, and there's a lot of historical details, kind of moving parts, so to speak, with a lot of this stuff. So go back, review, and all that good stuff. One thing with the argument from silence too is just keep in mind, Josephus is writing to a Roman audience who practiced exposure as a regular thing for like sex selection, or basically infanticide was like a normal thing for them. And so, and you're also thinking like Bethlehem is a little hamlet of just a few hundred people. And so we're talking about maybe a dozen babies at the most. It may not have been something that necessarily even got his attention. And so anyways, I hope that helps. And thanks so much for coming up, Lars.
Can I just like, or is there other people before me?
There are many, and I probably should get to the next one. But here's the thing. If you have doubts, if you have, things that you would like to talk to us further about,
can I just stand in queue and wait until?
Well, no. What I was going to say is check out You can if you want to, but check out talkaboutdoubts.com, and you could do a one-on-one or two-on-one conversation. So this is just like a little sampling. We could actually spend, much more time with you, just kind of one-on-one or two-on-one, unpacking some of these things for you and showing you the evidence for Christianity and all of that good stuff. Yeah. So,
but if you guys don't mind, like I just have a real quick question. Like it doesn't take like long at all.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
All right. So as I said, I have an older sister. The one that died, unfortunately, she was actually murdered. And
sorry to hear that.
Yeah. But one thing, I have 2 younger siblings, and they've been scared lately of like horror stories online and whatever. And
Sure.
I've always wanted to tell them, like, don't worry, God will protect you. But I've always been worried about, like, what if they ask me, if God will protect us, why did God not protect Lisa, my older sibling that was murdered?
Do you have a pastor, Lars?
I don't really have a church, to be honest.
Do you have a church locally that you can go to?
Here in Sweden, it's very hard to find a
Yeah.
real church. It's either state-controlled propaganda or false teachings.
Sure. No, I understand. Man, that's just really hard, and I don't think I could give you that. There's so much that one could say to something like that, and honestly, that would take a long time. And so,
I understand. No
I-
problem.
right. And so, I mean, I just think like we're not necessarily promised perfect safety in this world. Obviously, the
Like, as an adult, I
apostles
understand that, but like,
apostles
how
were
do I?
martyred. Yeah, how you explain that to a child? That's why I was like, do you have a pastor? Because we have people that specialize. We have pastors. We have people who are counselors that help. We talk about doubts. I'm just not one of them. I'm more of a history guy. So
I
I feel like
understand.
what I'm going to give you just isn't as good of an answer as what you could get from somebody else. And so,
Yeah.
and if I did try to really unpack it, it would take a lot. And unfortunately, just for time's sake, we have to move on. Not to be
Right. No, I
unfeeling about
understand.
the situation,
No,
because
no.
that's a
Don't
heartbreaking.
don't worry
Yeah,
about it at all. Don't worry.
yeah, that's absolutely
But God
heartbreaking. And
bless
I,
your work, and
yeah,
yeah.
well, I pray
Uh,
for peace and blessings and comfort, especially for you and all your family, because that's a horrible situation to go through. So,
yeah.
all right, man.
Thank you so much. God bless you guys.
Yep. Take care. Thanks for coming up, Lars. All right. So let's see if we got Maestro real quick. All right, sir.
Hello.
Maestro, what you got?
Hello. Good evening. So the question I had was about Mark 10:18
Mhm.
and how Muslims use it. Specifically the Mark 10:20 verse, since that's when the rich man stopped calling Jesus the good teacher.
Mhm.
That's pretty much the whole justification I see from them, and I would like to know if there's a counter argument to this, to their argument. Yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you just look at Mark in isolation, then maybe they would sort of have a point. And even then, when you read like just the verse in isolation, with the whole good teacher thing and all that other stuff, and he just basically, it looks like that he's just calling himself a man. But if you look at like even just the rest of the Gospel of Mark, it is full of Jesus either claiming to be God, doing things that only God can do, or being explicitly called God. And so,
Give
I
an
think,
example if you want.
yeah, let's look at some of the examples. Let me
Can you share?
pull
Can
up
you
your
bring
screen there.
There you go.
Yep.
This is the text here in Mark 10 that you have in mind, where Jesus is approached by this man who says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." Now, you could understand this as Jesus saying, "I'm not good. I'm not God because I'm not good."
Yeah.
Or you could understand it as Jesus inviting the men to consider more deeply who he's dealing with. Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. So these are two possible interpretations of this text. And when we have two possible interpretations, we want to look for other texts to give us some clarity, right? So we want to interpret less clear texts in light of clearer ones. So let's just stay in the Gospel of Mark, and we'll go to Mark 2. All right. So so famously in Mark chapter 2, Jesus heals the paralyzed man, And he says to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the scribes are sitting there questioning in their hearts, why does this man speak like that? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And immediately, Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they thus questioned within themselves, said to them, "Why do you question these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise, take up your bed and walk?" And verse 10 is crucial. "But that you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, rise, pick up your bed, and go home." And of course, he does so. So Jesus in verse 10 very clearly identifies himself as the Son of Man. And the context makes it clear he's not talking about Son of Man in merely an idiomatic sense of talking about humanity. He's talking about the Son of Man from the book of Daniel, who receives authority and sovereign power and so forth. Now, with that in mind, let's continue reading in chapter 2. And we come to this passage in where Jesus is where Jesus' disciples are charged with violating the Sabbath. It says one Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain, and the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for men, not men for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, the reason I brought up the previous text before going to this one is because there's two possible interpretations of verse 28 that are offered. One is to say that the view that Eric and I would take, that the Son of Man Jesus is actually identifying himself as Lord of the Sabbath, which would be a pretty provocative claim to deity. Another interpretation is to say, well, Jesus is using Son of Man here in an idiomatic sense, in the way that it's used throughout Ezekiel, for example, or in Psalm 8, to refer to humanity. Right, so mankind is Lord of the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So mankind is master of the Sabbath, or something like that. The reason why we favor the former interpretation is because in the context of this chapter, Jesus has already identified himself explicitly as the Danielic Son of Man. And so contextually, it seems quite probable that he's identifying himself as uniquely Lord of the Sabbath, which is a provocative claim to divine identity. Moreover, also in this chapter, Jesus is questioned about fasting. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why did John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast." So Jesus identifies himself as the bridegroom, which is an image that we see throughout the Old Testament that is applied to the Lord God of Israel in relation to his people. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, in Isaiah 54:5, "For your Maker is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer, the God of the whole earth he is called." Or in Isaiah 62 verse 5, where it says, "For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you." Or Hosea 2, 19 and 20 says, "And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. And I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord," and so forth. Or you could go to Ezekiel 16, or Ezekiel 20, speaking about the Lord's faithless bride, or Ezekiel 23, and so forth. There's Jeremiah 2 verse 2 as well, where it says, "Go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem, thus says the Lord, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness, in a land not sown," and so forth. And so again, we see God presented as a bridegroom in relation to his people. And so it's quite striking then that Jesus says, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them?" As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. So there's a couple of different reasons just from Mark 2 to think that Jesus is God. And there's other reasons from Mark, and for that matter, from the other Gospels as well, to affirm Jesus' divine identity. And so when we come to a text like Mark 10, I would favor the second interpretation the first interpretation, which is that, I would favor the latter interpretation I offered, that Jesus is actually inviting the man to consider who he is dealing with. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I have another question. So
Oh.
I've been, I don't know how long ago, I've read Dan McClellan's Divine Image, a book on divine images, and he says that, I think he justifies it that since Jesus is like, how to say it in English, a mediator between God and humans, that he can have God's titles like Lord Yahweh, Yahweh, and Lord of the Sabbath, and the rest of the titles that use like the bridegroom and so on. So is that kind of, how to say it, counter argument for your argument that, your counter argument to the Muslim interpretation?
I don't think so. I think the scripture teaches quite clearly that there are there's a plural, that God, the Father and the Son are equally God, yet distinctive persons. One text is quite explicit on this is in John 1, where we read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. In fact, if you look up the Greek text here, it says en arche en ologos, ke ologos en prostontion, ke theos en ologos. And you'll notice that the anarthus predicate nominative, theos, precedes the verb en, which we translate was. And in Greek grammar, this is taken as a qualitative. So it's a qualitative theos, meaning the word was divine, or the way that I would prefer to render this is all that God was, the word also was. In fact, Dan Wallace, in his book Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, comments on this text, and he notes, the most likely candidate for theos is qualitative. This is true both grammatically, for the largest proportion of preverbal anarthus predicate nominatives fall into this category, and theologically, both the theology of the fourth gospel and of the New Testament as a whole. There is a balance between the words deity, which is already present in the beginning, and arche, theos en, and his humanity, which was added later, zarx egenedo, 114. The grammatical structure of these two statements mirrors each other. Both emphasize the nature of the word rather than his identity. But theos was his nature from eternity, hence emi is used, while zarx was added at the incarnation, hence gilomi is used. Such an option does not at all impugn the deity of Christ. Rather, it stresses that although the person of Christ is not the person of the Father, their essence is identical. Possible translations are as follows: what God was, the Word was, or the Word was divine. In the second translation, divine is acceptable only if it is a term that can be applied only to true deity. However, in modern English, we use it with reference to angels, theologians, even Emil. Thus, divine can be misleading in an English translation. The idea of a qualitative theos here is that the word had all the attributes and qualities that the God of 1:1b had. In other words, he shared the essence of the Father, though they differed in person. The construction the evangelist chose to express this idea was the most concise way he could have stated that the word was God, and yet was distinct from the Father.
Okay, but also, what about it when John uses it? When Jesus says to the Pharisees, "You are Theos," I think he used the word Theos. And John,
You mean in John
chapter 10? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
so let's look at John chapter 10. So let's look at the whole context so that we understand exactly what Jesus is saying. So let's start from verse 22, and I'll bring in some historical points here as well. So at that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, right? This is the sort of detail that you might expect to be etched on the vivid recollection of an eyewitness who was there, right? It was winter. He remembers exactly the setting for this particular discourse. And not only that, but he tells us precisely where it happened. Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. Now, Josephus tells us that there were these roofed walkways in Solomon's temple in the outer court. in the court of the Gentiles. And he tells us that these cloisters belonged, or the walkways belonged to the outer court, and were situated in a deep valley, and had walls that reached 400 cubits in length, and were built of square and very white stones, the length of which stones was 20 cubits, and their height 6 cubits. This was the work of King Solomon, who first of all built the entire temple. He also tells us elsewhere that these cloisters were roofed. And so you can see from the dimensions and description here, together with the fact that they were roofed, which Josephus tells us elsewhere, it would have provided shelter from the elements of winter. And so it's quite fitting then that Jesus is walking in the temple in the colony of Solomon. But notice just in how casually these statements are related to each other in John 10:22 and 23. So we continue. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Jesus answered them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe because you are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them and they follow me." Right? This is an echo of Psalm 95.
Okay.
Which says, "For he is our God, we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as in the day at Massah in the wilderness." Right? So, so Jesus is echoing this text here, and he says, "My sheep hear my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life," which is something only that could be said of God, "and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand," which is an echo of Isaiah 43:13, which says, "Also henceforth I am he, there is none who can deliver from my hand. I work and who can turn it back." Also Deuteronomy 32:39, which says, "See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God besides me. I kill and I wake alive, I wound and heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand." And so Jesus says, "No one has snatched them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand." So just as no one snatches out of the Son's hand, no one snatches out of the Father's hand. And in that context, he says in verse 30, "I and the Father are one." And the Jews understand exactly what he means. He's not talking merely about an ontological, he's not talking merely about a functional unity with the Father, unity of purpose, but he's talking about an ontological unity. In verse 31, the Jews give the appropriate response. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. And Jesus answered them, "I have shown you many good works from the Father, for which them are going to stone me." And this, by the way, is another mark of verisimilitude in this text, because it expresses Jesus' sarcastic wit, or his sarcastic tone that we see expressed throughout different sources across different scenes. For instance, in Matthew 12, when Jesus is confronting the scribes and Pharisees that pride themselves on the knowledge of the scriptures, he says, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry?" And he does this multiple times. Or in Luke 13, Jesus, when responding to the Pharisees who caution him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you," he says, "Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons, perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course. Nevertheless, I must go on my way today and tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that prophet should perish away from Jerusalem." We see Jesus' sarcastic tone across different scenes, across different sources, which is consistent with the historical reportage view. And the Jews answered him, "It's not for a good work that we're going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God." Verse 34, Jesus answered them, "Is it not written in your law, I said you are gods?" Which is from Psalm 82. "If you called them gods to whom the word of God came, and the scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said I am the Son of God?" He says, "If I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me, and I am in the Father." Again, they sought to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. Now, Psalm 82 is the text that Jesus is alluding to here. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And the gods here, that term, Elohim, is sometimes used of beings who are less than deity, like in Psalm 8, it's used of angels, for example. In Exodus 7:1, Moses is called Elohim. It means Elohim to Pharaoh and so on. So the gods here are the wicked and corrupt judges of Israel, and God is holding judgment over them. "How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked, Selah? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Obtain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods." In other words, I said you are my representatives, sons of the Most High, all of you. "Nevertheless, like men you shall die, and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. And so Jesus' point then is that he's not comparing himself to these wicked and corrupt judges of Israel, to whom the word of God came in judgment, but rather he is saying that if it was even said of them, I said you were gods, sons of the Most High, all of you, then all the more can it be said of one who actually deserves the title, one who is actually divine. And the fact that he is actually divine is made apparent from the surrounding context, in particular Jesus' statement, I and the Father are one, given the preceding verses. Does that make sense?
Yes. Just one question. Do you know anybody who could I ask to refute Dan McClellan on his divine images theory, or who could I pay to do that, or something like that?
I'm not sure. I mean, Anthony Rogers is particularly good on the deity of Christ. Maybe him, for example.
I know Michael Jones has been reading through some of that stuff with Dan, or of Dan's stuff on this particular issue, and the whole divine image Christology to me has like a really unfalsifiability of it that kind of bothers me. It's like it could just be stretched so far, like a wax nose, that like I don't know. I don't.
Yeah, I mean, if the divine image view was wrong, how would we know?
Yes. But
if it was wrong, how would we know? It's like it could be stretched like in any direction almost. It's just, oh well, that's just divine image.
Explain any set of observations. So no matter what Jesus says about his divine identity, you can interpret it through that lens. So it's something that has infinite explanatory power really lacks any explanatory power.
Okay.
Yeah. But I know Michael has looked into it. I think he's planning on working on some of it, but he's kind of got some other side things that he's been doing lately. And so I could reach out to him and ask if he's making any kind of like response. I know he's done like a few responses to Dan that do mention the divine image Christology, but they're not like super in depth. But I think he was planning on doing something. I'm just not 100% sure. And so, but yeah, the unfalsifiability of it is the thing that just smacks to me is like more scholarly posturing from Dan without good epistemological foundations, which is kind of the usual for him. So anyways, Maestro, thanks so much for coming up. I hope that helped.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and goodbye from Europe. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, man. Take care. All right. Well, that was good. All right. So good questions so far, guys. Yeah, we got a few more of you waiting. Real quick, I'm going to just jump into a couple super chats. Won't take very long at all. Bart Irvin says that the Gospel of Mark was given the name Mark instead of Peter because there was already a Gnostic Gospel of Peter. How do we respond? I don't know where Bart has ever said that. I don't think that he does think that the Gospel of Peter, which is, I'm pretty positive he would acknowledge as a 2nd century document. And Bart specifically says that Mark was written like in the mid to late 1st century. So,
but Ehrman would maintain that the attributions of authorship came much later, which is of course a point that we test. So I don't think that the Gospels did initially circulate anonymously. And I mean, Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century seems to have known the traditional attribution because he calls them the memoirs of the apostles, which are also called Gospels. And he says that they were composed by the apostles and those who followed them, which is consistent with Matthew and John being the apostles and those who followed them being Mark and Luke. And then Tatian, Justin Martyr's student, composed the Diatessaron, which is a harmony of our 4 canonical Gospels. And Justin Martyr actually refers to Mark's Gospel as the Memoirs of Peter. And then later sources that call it the Gospel of Mark, namely Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian of Carthage, Irenaeus of Lyon, and so forth. And so that's surprising if they didn't have grounds for thinking that Mark really was the author, because why would you go from calling it the Memoirs of Peter to the Gospel of Mark? Mark's a fairly obscure character who's best known for his withdrawing from Paul and Barnabas when they were going to Pamphylia, and he leaves them and goes to Jerusalem in Acts 13, verse 13. And then it ultimately leads to a sharp falling out with Barnabas in Acts chapter 15. That's surprising. It's not the only argument for traditional authorship, but it is one pointer to traditional authorship.
Right. Tertullian also says, in railing against Marcion, he's like, you have a gospel without a name on it. That was his criticism, because Marcion basically took, instead of using the 4, he took 1, Luke, and he mutilated it and took the name off of it, basically. And basically Tertullian's argument, and Tertullian was a lawyer, was like, we don't do that. That's what you do. And so yeah, it's unlikely to be made up, and we don't think every scrap of manuscript evidence that we have attributes it to Mark. Every church father attributes it to Mark, and goes back as early as Jonathan mentioned. It definitely looks like Justin Martyr. So yeah. Let's see. Just one more real quick. How do we explain the dead coming to life in Matthew? I'm guessing this is kind of the whole Matthew zombies argument, this great massive event of all these people in Jerusalem supposedly popping out of their graves and walking through Jerusalem, but no other gospel author mentions it. And so, Jonathan, what's your quick answer for that one?
Yes, this is in Matthew 27, verses 52 and 53. And I mean, the objection to it is just an argument from silence. The fact that we don't have any other sources concerning it isn't really a particularly strong argument. There's many events in history that we only have one source for, or where you might expect something to be recorded in the source, but it isn't. The mass suicide at Masada that is written of in Josephus is found in only one source, for example, where Masada was the last Jewish holdout against the Romans that finally fell in 73 AD. And according to the story related in Josephus, which is, to be fair, disputed, so it's not consensus that this is actually historical, but Josephus tells us that Eleazar, who was in charge at Masada, basically encouraged the Sicarii who were at that fortress to commit suicide, because it was better to commit suicide than to take one's life by one's own hand than to end up being crucified and or sold into slavery, in the case of probably the women and children who were there. And Josephus says that he learned this because there were some female survivors and some children that had hidden themselves, and they came and reported to the Romans what had happened. But that's only found in Josephus. But I wouldn't say that the fact that it's not found in any other source is a particularly strong reason to discount the historicity of the event. There's also, Josephus is the only first century source that mentions the siege of Jerusalem at all, the destruction of the temple and so forth. So yeah, I don't find the argument from silence to be a particularly strong argument. In fact, Tim McGrew, our colleague, has a peer-reviewed academic paper on arguments from silence and why they are weak in historiography. An example he gives in this paper, for instance, is that Ulysses Grant, Abraham Lincoln's general during the American Civil War, fails to mention the Emancipation Proclamation. But we don't conclude from that it's ahistorical. Or Pliny the Younger, and when it doesn't mention the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, even though he gives a detailed account of the eruption itself, etc. It's also noteworthy that Matthew's account is very brief and is lacking in detail. He says the tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. It's not clear how much Matthew knows about this incident. He doesn't mention how many people were raised, who they were, who they appeared to. It's lacking in detail, and so it's fairly modular. Even if Matthew's source wasn't wasn't accurate here. It's I don't think it really impacts our overall trust or the overall trustworthiness of the Gospel of Matthew. It may be some story that Matthew had heard that he thought worthy of inclusion, and he doesn't really seem to know much about it. It doesn't give many details. Would that be similar to your own perspective on that, Eric?
Yeah, and then also just our reasons for trusting Matthew. I mean, like you said, it is very brief, but overall, when we look at Matthew's gospel, there's a ton of positive evidence for the reliability of Matthew, as for all the other gospels. And so our reasons for trusting Matthew, we're willing to give him the benefit of the doubt because he gets so many other things right time and time and time after again. And if we think about it, we do have good positive evidence for the resurrection. And so if God wanted to, as a sign perhaps to a handful of people in Jerusalem, raise some saints, and maybe they go and appear and let them know like what happened and where they go after that. I don't know, ascend to heaven or what. I don't know, because Matthew doesn't really tell us. But if God is going to do something like the resurrection of Jesus, and there could be possible reasons that God could do this, then and we have positive evidence for that, then it's I don't really see this as a big stumbling block. And so I know a lot of internet skeptics and people like to bring it up. Alex O'Connor seems to always want to bring it up as this some sort of argument from weirdness, it's just this weird passage. But I don't find any of those arguments to be very powerful. And so thank you so much for the super chat, Dave and Faith on Fire. I appreciate that. And so next up, we're going to go I probably should have brought this up at the beginning. Jonathan has some other appointments and places where he needs to be. So we're going to shoot for about an hour and 45 minutes. We've been going an hour and 5 so far, thereabouts. And so we could probably take, and we'll see how it goes depending on how rapid fire some of these folks are, if they take a little while. So Udo, you had some questions about Islamic traditions compared to the gospel traditions, and how we can kind of compare the two and know what's trustworthy and what's not. And so are you still there?
Yes. Hello, brothers. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you well. Good.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. My question is the following. You summed it up to explain it. Muslims often say that the hadiths are more historical reliable than the Gospels. And I know that you have to differentiate at this point, because the Gospels were written down relatively shortly after Jesus' ascension, while the Hadiths were first transmitted orally over generations, and only later scholars developed criteria to classify the hundreds of thousands of Hadiths that had been collected previously. However, we have to admit that it is a very complex and meticulous system. For example, there must be an unbroken chain of eyewitnesses to Muhammad. The reliability of the narrators has to be verified, and it is also determined whether the tradition is transmitted by multiple reliable chains. And it is often said that we cannot demonstrate such a thing with the Gospels. And I actually know that early church tradition unanimously states that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or people who knew the eyewitnesses. This was the consensus in the early church. However, Muslims would argue against this, that we cannot give a chain of evidence is not like with the Sahih Hadith, to prove that the books are written by these individuals. And I know that with no ancient works we can do this, because in the antiquity this method didn't exist. But nevertheless, Muslims would say, because of this complex system of classification and verification of reliability, the hadiths are more reliable, and the Gospels are not, because they don't fit the criteria. And my question is, what would you say to that?
I mean, for me, there's. I feel like once you know the proper isnad chain, you could just be like, oh yeah, and attribute anything you want, as long as you feel like it goes back. Most of the hadiths, they're not even compiled until like 100, over 100, 200 years or more later. The vast majority of them were rejected because of supposed like weak links in the chain. But I feel like, again, once you understand like what is going to pass the chain and you can rattle off the names, then what is stopping you from then creating whatever stories that you want? The hadiths are full of contradictions. But I think even more importantly, even Yasser Qadi recently admitted, like, Western scholarship thinks hadith science is junk, that it's bogus, that he basically just has to take it as an article of faith. Joshua Little has written a whole dissertation critiquing the reliability of the hadiths. There are long interviews with him on YouTube that you could avail yourself to. But on the side of the reliability of the Gospels, first of all, we have these aren't coming from a long chain of oral tradition that were put together 200 years after the events. We're talking about, Mark being all of these were first century documents written within the lifetime of Jesus and the apostles. They're written by. We can make arguments that they go back to the traditional authors or companions of the traditional authors, as Jonathan was just alluding to. And not only that, but we can show within the clues within the very Gospels themselves and how we can corroborate them through external history and not just like matters of major detail, like, the existence of Pontius Pilate or Herod or different things like that, but in minor details, minor historical details, some of those points which Jonathan already brought up in some of the conversations that we've already had with a few people with their questions, not to mention numerous points of undesigned coincidences that all point to the fact that these are sources that go back to people who were eyewitnesses, that were close up to or they're sourced in eyewitnesses that are knowledgeable and close up to the facts. Whereas like hadiths are just like, here's a random saying from Muhammad, or here's something random that happened. And all of these were compiled far, far away 200 years after the events. And again, if somebody just knows the proper chain, I feel like they could almost tack on anything that they want. And so I don't think that these are just really, I don't know, like a strong case for much of anything. So,
to what extent are you familiar with the case for the Gospels and Acts being eyewitness testimony?
Well, I actually studied a lot about the question if the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, and I also studied much the early Christian tradition, and yeah, I'm very familiar with that topic actually. But actually, in comparison to the Hadith, it actually was often a point which made me difficulties in discussions with Muslims, because I know that you can make up a chain of transmitters and so on, but the point is, in the Hadith science, there's not only it's not only about that there is a chain of narrators. You also check the reliability and the ability of memory of the narrators, and also check if there are independent chains of narration who transmit the same tradition and so on. It's a very complex system.
Mm-hmm. So you said that you're familiar with the case for the Gospels and Acts being eyewitness testimony. How do you evaluate those arguments?
Yeah, I would say for the standards of ancient literature, these are actually very strong arguments. because we have a biography of Jesus Christ within a century in comparison to other.
Well, that's not an argument that we would use for the Gospels and Acts being eyewitness testimony.
Well, for example, I would use as arguments the external and internal evidence.
Mm-hmm.
The external evidence would be the early church tradition, and internal evidence would be the, for example, in Acts, the self-reference of the author, or for example, in the Gospel of John, you have many hints that the author of the Gospel was actually very close.
But more particularly, you have numerous points of historical confirmation of matters of specific detail in the Gospels and Acts. Are you familiar with that case?
Yeah. I also know, for example, Colin J. Hemer published a book where there are where he shows that there are many historic details which can only be known by an eyewitness and so on. And I also know that there are also books about the same case with the Gospels, that they write things that can only be known by someone who actually knew the Jewish culture, the geography of first century Palestine, and so on. I actually know these arguments.
Mm-hmm. And why don't you find them convincing?
Why I find them convincing?
Or unconvincing? Like what? Are you looking for answers that you can give to a Muslim about Hadith, or are you just looking for, or are these arguments that they're bringing to you like causing you to have questions and consider like maybe Islam is true or something like that?
Well, actually, not if Islam is true, but the question is here actually, are the Hadiths with that complex system, and I'm talking about the Hadiths which are classified as Sahih, which have gone through all that criteria to be classified as that, are from a historic perspective more reliable than the Gospels?
Well,
if actually the question.
Yeah. Well, if Luke is a traveling companion of Paul, and Mark is a companion of Peter, and John and Matthew are themselves apostles, like what would you prefer, firsthand, or like people who actually had the opportunity to be with the people that were firsthand and interview them, or a long chain of narrators and a bunch of hadiths, most of which have been rejected, and even Sahih hadiths, which often contradict one another and report numerous things of nonsense, like eating 7 ajwa dates will make you immune to poison and immunity, or different things like that. I'm not saying that like some of the sayings or things that they record don't actually go back to a historical Muhammad, but even like the important things that maybe they might bring up, like Muhammad allegedly splitting the moon, which is just based on a very obscure passage in Surah 54, and then like a few Sahih narrations where you get like a little bit of more detail, but not much, is really going to move the needle for me in terms of like, this is evidence for your faith. And so like, I think what I'm saying, and maybe what Jonathan is saying too, is like we see like an embarrassment of positive riches for Christianity from witnesses, things that we can tell, like you said, through Hemmer and different people like that, that point to this being from direct eyewitnesses, versus just like a really long chain compiled 200 years later. Even if they can say, well, look, our system is so scrupulous and all this other stuff, it's just like, well, okay, well, nobody takes it really very seriously except you guys.
And actually, Professor Caddy recently acknowledged that in Quranic scholarship, Hadith isnad-chains are not taken seriously.
Okay. Well, actually, I would also say that eyewitness testimony is very more reliable than a long chain of narration. But
Yes.
I think actually you misunderstood my point a little bit, because the point is not if the Gospels are more reliable when they are eyewitness testimony. The
Mhm.
question is rather that we can give a chain of evidence like the Isnad, that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or people who
I
knew
mean, sure, you have Irenaeus, who was a student of Polycarp. And I'm sure you've probably heard this, but Irenaeus
Yes.
names all the 4 gospel authors. He says that he's a student of Polycarp, who's a student of John. And so,
I knew the apostles more broadly as well.
yeah. And so, not to mention, like, he's not the only person who's giving us this attribution of authorship. It's already something that's unanimous in
And
like,
the
through
primary
others.
evidence is internal to the Gospels themselves, such that whoever wrote the Gospels, it has to look something very much like traditional authorship. And we if you're interested, we can get into some of the evidence for that. But the patristic sources is usually something I might discuss after I've laid out kind of the evidence that is internal to the Gospels themselves, because I think that stuff is primary and more impressive.
Okay, but to go back to the patristic evidence, yeah, I know that from the patristics, you know that Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp, who actually again was a student of John. But actually, the problem here is, for first, Irenaeus doesn't say that he got the information about the Gospels from Polycarp. He said that he was a student of him, but he didn't say that he got this specific information from him. And actually, there is some discussion whether the term that he was a student is to be understood, because he actually doesn't say that he was a student. He just says when he was young, he heard Polycarp's teaching. But to hear someone's teaching is not the same to be a personal student.
I mean, Jonathan's going to look up the quote, but I mean, to me, it's like a reasonable inference that he would have got the attribution of authorship possibly from them. But either way, this was a tradition that just didn't like appear out of nowhere. It's not as if Irenaeus made this up. Justin Martyr is already mentioning that the Gospels are they're memoirs of the apostles and companions of the apostles.
So
go ahead.
Here's the more significant text from Polycarp. So he, right. So this is from Against Heresies, Volume 3, Chapter 3. It says, but Polycarp also was not only instructed by apostles and conversed with many who had seen Christ, but was also by apostles in Asia appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna, whom I also saw in my early youth, for he tarried on earth a very long time, and when a very old man, gloriously and most nobly suffering martyrdom, departed this life, having always taught the things which he had learned from the apostles, and which the church has handed down, and which alone are true. Right. So Polycarp's connection to the apostles goes beyond John. There is another text where he talks about how Polycarp knew John. This is it here. Right. So, or actually, this is one of them. There's another one as well, where he says that, and these things are borne witness to in writings by Papias, the hero of John, and the companion of Polycarp in his 4th book, for there were 5 books compiled by him. I think there's another text as well that attests that Polycarp personally knew John. But in any case, so Polycarp's fairly close up to the Irenaeus is close up to the facts, knowing Polycarp who knew the apostles, and so his attribution of authorship, I think, carries clout. But as I said before, the primary argument I would want to emphasize is the evidence that's internal to the Gospels themselves.
Okay, so you would rather look to the internal evidence than to the external evidence.
Yeah, I think both are strong, but I think that the internal evidence is even stronger.
Yeah, but the problem of that point is actually, for example, in first century Palestine or Judea, I would rather say, there can also be someone who was at that place and knew all the culture and geographical stuff, but he can also make things up.
Sure. I mean, to that, I would say when somebody is constantly telling you the truth over and over and over again, and it's like you can actually cross-check them, then you don't just like automatically go, oh, just where he says, where I want to say he's just making stuff up, that's where he's making stuff up. Like that doesn't give us any kind of like, that doesn't have any like clear picture of a unified author, right? That's like a schizophrenic author who 1 minute is like telling you all this truth, but then like he's just kind of making stuff up. And so if what we say about the Gospels is right, then that there were written by people who knew people who were close up to the facts, were habitually truthful, and were quite scrupulous, then what is claimed in the Gospels goes back to the original eyewitnesses, and they're bringing forth these claims in front of a hostile audience. And
Right.
so there's that aspect of, suffering, persecution, and different things like that. And then there's just the aspect of like, you have no unified picture of an author. I could say that about anybody, and just, there's no falsifiability with that. And so you can't just say, well, just where I think they're making stuff up, but everything else is right. Like, that's kind of weird. Also, it's not even the genre of like this whole idea of like modern historical fiction where, you have all these real places and you have all these real names and all of this real setting, but it's a total fictional work. That whole genre didn't really become a thing until like over 1,000 years later. And so that's just not really a thing.
The way, here's the other text that I had in mind from Irenaeus, where he actually he's actually in a quote in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, and he quotes, if you pull it up, Eric. He's quoting from Irenaeus, and Irenaeus says, "I remember the events of that time more clearly than those of recent years. For what boys learn, growing with their mind, becomes joined with it, so that I am able to describe the very place in which the blessed Polycarp sat as he discoursed, and his goings out and his comings in, and the manner of his life, and his physical appearance, and his discourses to the people, and the accounts which he gave of his intercourse with John and with the others who had seen the Lord. And as he remembered their words and what he heard from them concerning the Lord and concerning his miracles and his teaching, having received them from eyewitnesses of the word of life, Polycarp related all things in harmony with the scriptures." Right. So we saw that he's a companion of Papias, who was a hearer of John. Irenaeus says. Irenaeus also tells us that Polycarp had interaction with the Apostle John. And so it's a reasonable inference for us to draw that he was himself a student of John. But in any case, his acquaintance with the apostles seems to have been broader than simply John, because Irenaeus tells us that he knew the apostles personally in this text here from Against Heresies. But I think, as I said before, the primary point that we would want to emphasize is the internal evidence that reveals that the authors of the Gospels were close up to the facts and well-informed and habitually scrupulous. And that is best explained on the hypothesis that the testimonies in the Gospels and Acts represent the testimony of eyewitnesses.
All right, Udo, I got time for one more person to bring up, so I hope that helps. We will do these in the future, so if you have future questions, let us know. You could also check out talkaboutdoubts.com if you have further questions, and we could maybe be of more assistance there. But it's a good question. I appreciate you coming up, and thanks for coming on.
I actually say it's a pity that that time is running, because I would also say some things to the things that you just said. But I have respect for that also other people want to come up and ask questions. But one question I just want to ask you, talked about people who examined the the reliability of the hadiths from a historical perspective. Can you give me some sources for that?
Joshua Little is one. He wrote his dissertation on the whole marriage of Aisha thing. He was trying to protect people against supposedly Islamophobia in one sense, but at the same time he says that the hadiths are totally unreliable. He gives 20 plus reasons, and if you just look up Joshua Little hadith, even on YouTube, there's like 3-hour long discussions where he talks about the hadiths and why he doesn't find them to be a reliable source of historical information.
Okay.
He's a PhD. So
okay.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, brothers. God may bless you for your work, and greetings from Germany.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, man.
Yeah,
Take care. All right. We got time for one more, and I saw. Remember, I've been putting in the chat. I hope you're paying attention to the private chat. So because some of you've been waiting longer, but you haven't given me what you're looking for. So Michael, on the other hand, he had some questions about the authorship of the Gospels, and he gave some details. So Michael, what's up, man? What's your question?
Yeah, what's up? Can you hear me just fine?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, my question was about kind of the process of how I'm a Christian. I'm also somewhat of a religious scholar. I have my degree in religion. But I was wondering how modern scholars are able to get away with the claim that the Gospels are anonymous when the earliest manuscripts clearly attribute them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Like what hoops are being jumped through here? If you could just outline the process of what's going on there.
I'm not sure if I could exactly get into their head as to why. It almost feels like in some cases, I mean, I want to be careful because I don't want to psychologize too much, but like it just feels a little bit groupthinky to me at some point. But basically, it seems like the argument is just that the first real attribution that they feel confident about is Irenaeus, and that's 180 or so. And even though like all the manuscripts are unanimous, most of them do come from Egypt, just because papyrus is better preserved in the desert than it is in other places. And so they kind of feel like that's just more centralized, I suppose. Obviously, they're going to say that Matthew and John were given to the names to give some sort of authority. I'm sure you've probably heard all these kind of arguments before.
Yeah.
They say the same with Luke and Mark. I don't know how they get away with that, given, as Jonathan already mentioned earlier, that Mark was the one who was kind of infamous for bailing on Paul and causing a split between him and Barnabas, because Barnabas, which is interesting, by the way, because Colossians mentions just kind of out of nowhere that Mark was the cousin of Barnabas, but nowhere in Mark, the book of Acts, do we see like what they were fighting about or why there was so much heat about this particular thing, bringing him along. But we find out later that he's kin. And so you could kind of understand why Barnabas would go to bat for Mark, but Mark isn't particularly well known, and what he's known for isn't good. Then Luke, who is Luke? And so we could run through like a quick case for, if you want to know some of the internal and external.
Because I was reading I don't know if you're familiar, Luke Vandewey's book on Luke.
Yeah
I was going through that. I'm probably gonna have to go through it again because it's been a little while, but based on like onomastic congruence and like the eyewitness sources that Luke gets as credible sources, primary eyewitness sources. And so trying to figure out, well, if that's the case, if he got his sources, if his sources were primary witnesses and we can establish that, then that would mean that there's less credibility that he would need to like essentially copy all his data off of Mark.
Yeah. Do you want to see a sample of some evidences relating to that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure. So let me share my screen again here. 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we go over to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1. Oops. Nothing is working. Okay, so in Luke chapter 1, we have the prologue, where we read, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you in most excellent Theophilus, concerning that you may have certainty concerning things that you've been taught." And by the way, as a side point relating to the anonymous Gospels thesis, this is quite surprising if he's addressing this to an official, presumably his patron, by the name of Theophilus. If the Gospels are circulating anonymously, you would think that Theophilus might know who was addressing him, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Clement of Rome writes a letter to the Corinthian church, which is also technically anonymous, and he doesn't introduce himself as Clement in the letter, but presumably the letter contained his name. Seems quite probable that the Corinthians knew he was addressing them. In any case, be that as it may, Luke claims here to have received information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Right now, Luke also claims to be a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. In fact, he claims to be present with Paul in Acts 21 when Paul goes to the Jerusalem church. It says, "When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders are present." So he's present with Paul in Jerusalem in Acts 21. And we know from Galatians 2 that the leaders of the Jerusalem church included Simon Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John, the son of Zebedee. So and then also in Acts 24, Luke is present with Paul for at least 2 years in Caesarea Maritima, which is in relative geographical proximity to Jerusalem. It's about a couple days walk. In fact, just to show this on the map here,
Okay.
You'll see that here we go. So Jerusalem is over here, and Caesarea Maritima is over here, and it's a couple days walk. And so if Luke wanted, he would have had ample opportunity to interview and interact with, engage with the Jerusalem witnesses during that time, the witnesses of Jesus' life, and in particular, the purported witnesses of the resurrection. So not only does Luke claim that in his prologue that he has an interest in eyewitness testimony, but he has direct access to the testimony of witnesses. He has access to the testimony of Paul, and he has access to the testimony of the other apostles. And if we can establish that Luke really was, as he claims to be, a traveling companion of Paul, and we can confirm numerous details in the Gospel of Luke, that also confirms, furthermore, that not only does he have access to those living witnesses, but he also is extracting reliable information from those witnesses.
Yeah.
So not only does he have opportunity, but he actually availed himself of that opportunity. Now, here's a few points relating to the book of Acts. So Eric already mentioned this one. So in Acts chapter 15, we read that Paul and Barnabas have this sharp falling out over John Mark, who's previously withdrawn from them on a mission through Pamphylia and not gone with them to the work. We see this episode play out in Acts 13, verse 13, where it says that Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga and Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Now, reading Acts, it looks like there must be some sort of prior relationship, prior backstory between John Mark and Barnabas, of which Acts does not take note, right? He seemed really keen for John Mark to go. Now, if we go over to Colossians 4, Paul writes from Roman imprisonment, or in 60 to 62 AD, and he says, "Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas." Right? They're cousins. They actually have a familial relationship, which then explains this detail in Acts. But it doesn't look like, I mean, by the time Paul wrote Colossians, it looks like this rift has been resolved. It looks like they're on good terms by now. But Acts doesn't appear to be inventing this story to go with Colossians, because there's no mention there of the familial relationship. Notice so the purpose of this journey, the second mission of journey, is actually to check up on the converts of the previous journey, right? Let's return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. So Paul and Silas come to Derbe and Lystra in chapter 16. And his disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek, and he was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. So this indicates that Derbe or Lystra was Timothy's hometown, and he's apparently a convert already by the time of this visit. And in fact, in 2 Timothy, in 1 Timothy 1, Paul identifies him as my true child in the faith, and also in 2 Timothy 1, my beloved child, which implies that Timothy was most likely Paul's own convert. Now, which implies that he was converted during the first journey through these same places. Now, in 2 Timothy 3, Paul says to Timothy, "You, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions and sufferings that happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra, which persecutions I endured, yet from them all the Lord rescued me." And so Paul, the time of Timothy's conversion during that first trip would be at just the time when Paul underwent these sufferings alluded to in his letter to Timothy, which explains why Paul seems to imply in his letters to Timothy that Timothy had actually witnessed those sufferings. And so it fits in an undesigned and casual and incidental way, in a way that supports both the part of a broader case for the Pauline authorship of the pastorals, and also supports the historicity of Acts as well. In chapter 16, Paul and Silas cast out a spirit of divination from a slave girl, and this leads to them getting taken before the city authorities, and they're thrown in prison, and their feet are fastened in stocks. And that night, there's an earthquake, and they find their shackles loosed, and the jailer rushes in about to kill himself, because it's a very steep penalty for letting prisoners escape under your watch. And then Paul announces all are present, and so he becomes a believer, and his family get baptized. And we pick up the story in verse 35. When it was day, the magistrate sent the police saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrate has sent to let you go, therefore come now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They've beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out." The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them. They took them out and asked them to leave the city, and so on. Now, Paul writes about this in his own words in 1 Thessalonians 2. He says, "Though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict." How do the Thessalonians know about Paul's shameful treatment in Philippi? We're not told. The shameful treatment is that he'd been flogged despite being a Roman citizen, which was against Roman law. Well, if you look back at Acts, we see that chapter 17, it says, "When they passed through Ephesus and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews." So this very next port of call is, in fact, Thessalonica. This is actually on a major Roman highway. The Via Egnatia and Ephesus and Apollonia were overnight stops on that highway. And so that's also a piece of specialized local knowledge that Luke gets right. But this then dovetails with 1 Thessalonians and explains the phrase, "as you know." You can imagine Paul still full of indignation coming from Philippi to Thessalonica and recounting to the new converts there what just happened in Philippi. So 1 Thessalonians is arguably Paul's earliest letter, depending on when you dig Galatians. But Acts and 1 Thessalonians seem to be independent of each other for a few reasons. For example, in 1 Thessalonians 1, Paul emphasizes the conversion of pagans. You turn to God from idols and serve the living and true God. Whereas Acts emphasized the conversion of Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. So these appear to be independent sources for other reasons as well. And so this adds evidential force to this undesigned coincidence between Acts and 1 Thessalonians. In chapter 17, Paul is in Thessalonica, and this mob of Jews stir up trouble for them there in Thessalonica. So they have to leave in haste to go to Berea. And unfortunately, the crowd follow from Thessalonica to Berea and stir up trouble for them there too. It says, "When the Jews from Thessalonica learned the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to see, but Silas to remain there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and never receiving a command of Silas to come to him as soon as possible, they departed." This, by the way, is an example of an unexplained allusion, which is a mark of verisimilitude in its own right, that Silas to remain there without any explanation as to this cause of the separation of Paul from Silas and Timothy. But be that as it may, they're given the instruction to catch up with him as soon as possible. And so we presume that they catch up with him in Athens. But the next we see of them is actually in chapter 18, when Paul is in Corinth, in verse 5. So we wonder what's been taking them so long. Why are they only catching up with Paul now? Well, if we look up the map here, okay, so here is the map that shows this is Thessalonica, Berea, and Paul leaves in haste to go to Athens on the peninsula of Greece, and he leaves behind Silas and Timothy with instructions to catch up as soon as possible. But the next we see of them is when they catch up with Paul in Corinth. And so we wonder, what have they been doing this whole time? There's an unexplained gap in Acts. But if we go over to 1 Thessalonians 3, Paul says, Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved with these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass, and just as you know. For this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I said to learn about your faith, I feel that some of the attempt or attempted you in our labor would be in vain. And so apparently under the circumstances, Paul was concerned for the well-being of the Christians in Thessalonica. And so he commissioned Timothy to go back to Macedonia from Athens, hence we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, to check up on the Christians there in Thessalonica. Actually omits the sending of Timothy back from Athens. And so this detail in 1 Thessalonians helps to explain this otherwise unaccounted for gap in the book of Acts. Notice also that when Paul goes to Corinth, he meets with Aquila and Priscilla, who are tent makers, and they end up in Corinth from Rome because Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And Suetonius actually writes about this in his life of Claudius, that Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome at the instigation of one Chrestus, because they were continually making disturbances. And in the case of Aquila and Priscilla, they end up in Corinth, and Paul works with them as a tent maker. And then on the Sabbath day, so during the week he's working as a tent maker, but on the Sabbath he reasons with the Jews and Greeks, trying to persuade them that the Christ is Jesus. But then something happens in verse 5 that prompts him to revise his ministry model. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. Right, so the English translation doesn't do a particularly good job of rendering the nuance of the Greek there in verse 5. In fact, if you look up the NIV, it does a better job. It says, verse 5, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. In fact, if you look up the NAT, the New English Translation notes, where they explain some of their translation decisions, they note Seneco 6 states, Senecato to logo, Paul was wholly absorbed in preaching, Acts 18:5, in contrast to the activity cited in verse 3. The imperfect Senecato has been translated as an ingressive imperfect, became wholly absorbed, stressing the change in Paul's activity once Silas and Timothy arrived. At this point, Paul apparently began to work less and preach more. Right. So, what prompts him to change that ministry model? Well, we're not told in Acts, but if we go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul says, did I commit a sin, humbling myself so you might be exalted because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed of the churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need, so I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. And so apparently the brothers who came from Macedonia brought with them financial aid, financial supplies for Paul, which enabled him to change his ministry model. In fact, there's further support for this in Philippians 4. Philippi itself was a city in Macedonia. He said, it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. So this then explains why he's able to change his ministry model in response to the arrival of Silas and Timothy from Macedonia. And that's just the peak of the iceberg. I mean, there's many, many more that one could document. I'll just give you one quickly from Luke. So this is one from Luke. So the argument then is that Luke very clearly is a traveling companion of Paul, and he's habitually scrupulous in reporting the events in Acts. And we can also show numerous points of historical confirmation of the Gospel of Luke, which indicates not only does he claim an interest in eyewitness testimony, not only does he have access to eyewitness testimony, but he extracts reliable information from eyewitness testimony. So here's one example of numerous in Luke. So in Luke 13, it says, at that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you. Now, what's interesting is Jesus has already left Galilee at this point. We know this from verse 22. He went on his way through towns and villages, teaching and journeying towards Jerusalem. Now, Luke, when he mentions Herod Antipas, he emphasizes more than once that he's Tetrarch of Galilee, like in Luke 3:1, Herod being Tetrarch of Galilee. But if Jesus has already left Galilee at this point, then what it sends then is the Pharisees' caution, get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you. Well, let's look up Josephus again. Josephus tells us that following the death of Herod the Great, as this Herod's father, in 4 BC, his territory was divided among 3 of his sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. And he tells us that as for the other half, he divided 2 parts and gave it to 2 other of Herod's sons, to Philip and to Antipas. That Antipas he disputed with Archelaus for the whole kingdom. Now to him it was that Perea and Galilee paid their tribute, which amounted annually to 200 talents. So not only was Galilee under Herod's jurisdiction, but so was this other region called Perea. Now where's Perea? Well, let me show it on the map here. Perea is, as we'll see, is east of the Jordan River. Here we go. So it's up here. So this is Judea down here in the south, Galilee in the north, Samaria lies between them, and Perea is east of the Jordan River, and that flows north and south to the Dead Sea. So east of the Jordan River. Now, Luke doesn't inform us of where geographically this caution of the Pharisees takes place. But if we look at the other Gospels, we see that Jesus around this very time is spending time in Perea. So Matthew 19, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, which would be in the region of Perea, which then explains the significance of the Pharisees' caution: get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you. Jesus is actually at this time east of the Jordan River in Perea, under Herod's jurisdiction, a detail not supplied by Luke. So the accounts fit together in a way that makes sense on the historical reportage view.
Yeah, pretty important undesigned coincidence. Yeah.
Does that make sense, Michael?
Yeah.
Jonathan, could you real quickly, because I know we got to run, but because you got sort of, could you do the whole process of elimination thing with Luke and kind of some of the, because of all the internal evidence and the traveling companions of Paul? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, sure. So if Luke is a traveling companion of Paul, that gives us a short list, right? Because it's got to be someone who travels with him as far as I'll share my screen here again. It's got to be someone that travels with him as far as Rome. Okay, here we go. Okay. Okay, so if we go over to Colossians chapter 4, we have a short list of those individuals who are with Paul in prison in Rome. So it's got to be one of these guys, right? From verse 10, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. He also mentions in verse 11 Jesus, who is called Justus. And he mentions in verse 12 Epaphras, who is one of you. And he mentions in verse 14 Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas. So which of those individuals is the most probable candidate? Well, Aristarchus is actually distinguished from the author on the way to Rome in Acts 27:2. He's also a couple of other times distinguished as well. Here it says, embarking in a ship of the Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the port along the coast of Asia, we put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, right? So they're not the same guy. Demas is unlikely because he deserted Paul. We see in 2 Timothy 4:10. For Demas, in love with this present world, to desert him being gone to Thessalonica. The author seems to be a Gentile. So from his geographical competence and his interpretation of Judaism, most scholars are convinced that he wasn't a Palestinian Jew. So that would rule out the men of the circumcision, which would include Aristarchus. So I go over to Colossians. So that would include Aristarchus and Mark, who and Jesus, who is called Justus. So these are eliminated. The author's lack of interest in the Lycus Valley in Colossae may render Epaphras unlikely, because Epaphras is said to be one of you, so he's a Colossian. So that makes Luke the most probable candidate, which is consistent with the patristic evidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I just wanted to tie that real quick back to the original question with authorship. And so, Luke's book is really good. We have I have some points of disagreement with it, but overall it's freaking awesome. And I recommend it to a lot of people. So, and props, you get 20 based internet points for bringing up the term onomastic congruence. Michael,
I better be able to. Yeah.
So I appreciate that. And all that's good stuff. So, well, hopefully that helps. And thanks for coming up, man. And appreciate you.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, like I said, we were going to go about an hour and 45 minutes. We're at an hour and 53. I know there have been a couple of you that were waiting. I sincerely apologize. We will do other of these in the future. Also, if you want to talk to a counselor with Talk About Doubts and talk about some of the things that we're talking about, or maybe you have doubts because of the problem of evil. Maybe you have doubts because of science versus faith kind of reasons and different things like that. And maybe you've been told that, science contradicts the Bible or whatever it might be, divine hiddenness. Maybe you've been told that, miracles just aren't really a thing, or the probability of them is so low that we can never know if they really happened. Doesn't matter. We have somebody who can talk to you on any of these topics, one-on-one, two-on-one. As Jonathan said earlier, you can have one conversation. If it needs to spill into another conversation, those could be scheduled too. There's a Discord group you can join and all of these different things. And so just go to talkaboutdoubts.com and just fill out a contact submission form and give your information. Give as much detail as you possibly can about your doubts so that we can know who to pair you up with, how to talk to you, and all that other stuff. But we have seen testimony after testimony of people who have just received help, come to Christ for the first time, or held on to their faith amongst challenges and different things like that. And so, Jonathan, before we go, do you got any parting words or anything else that you'd want to let the audience know about Talk About Doubts or anything else real quick?
No, please just go over to talkaboutdoubts.com, and we'd love to be in touch to set up a private meeting, especially if you are a Christian with doubts, or a former Christian, or a non-Christian who's exploring the evidence for Christianity.
Yep. Awesome. So, and again, hopefully this is just kind of like a good sampling of that. Just that last call was, I've heard these things many, many times, and I never get tired of them because it's just powerful stuff. Speaking of which, I do have something in the works in the future for a live. I'm calling it the Big Axe stream. And so, but basically it's just a ton of positive evidence for the Book of Acts being reliable. And I'll also tackle objections mostly raised by Bart Ehrman against the historical reliability of Acts. So be on the lookout for that. And so, all right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for joining, and we will see you in the next one.